Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight's story takes us deep into the glittering, dangerous world of Elizabethan England, a time when beauty was power, and pale skin could mean the difference between favour and ruin. We'll uncover why the women of that age turned to white lead, a substance both adored and deadly, to make themselves beautiful. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. And please write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a quiet fan for that gentle hum in the background, and let's step together into the candlelit chambers of Gloriana's court. I suppose I should begin with the scent. That is what comes back to me first, even now, after all these years. Not the faces, not the voices, but the smell of her chamber in the mornings. Sweet almond oil and rosewater, yes. But beneath it, something sharper. Vinegar, perhaps, or the tang of metals left too long in damp air. And under all of it, faint but persistent, the smell of something turning. Like milk on the third day, like flowers pressed too long between pages. Have you ever noticed how memory works? How it picks not the grand moments, but the small ones. The angle of light through a narrow window, the sound of silk against stone, the particular cold of a pewter jug in winter. I was there, you understand. I was young, and I believed in England, and in glory, and in the woman who wore both like a second skin. I believed that beauty was a kind of armour, and that the court was the centre of all things bright and permanent. I was wrong, of course, but it took me 20 years to understand how wrong, and by then my hands had helped apply the very powders that made a mask of her face, and my silence had been purchased with small coins and smaller mercies. My name does not matter now. I was born in the year of our Lord 1559, the year she came to the throne. My mother told me I was blessed by that timing, as if the new Queen's coronation had somehow touched me in the womb, marked me for service. Perhaps it did. By the time I was 14, I was in London. By 15, I stood in the presence chamber at Whitehall, my hands chapped from the November cold, learning to curtsy without meeting anyone's eye. They called her Gloriana. They called her the Virgin Queen, the sun that never set, the jewel of Christendom. She was all of these things, I suppose, in the way that a painted altarpiece is sacred, lovely to behold, distant, gilded, and fixed in its perfection. But I learned to know her differently. I learned the hours before dawn, when the mask came off. Let me tell you how it was done. The year was 1576. I'd been at court for 3 years, working first in the scullery, then in the wardrobe, and finally, through luck or providence or the simple fact that I was small and quiet and quick with my fingers, I was taken into the private chambers. Not as a lady-in-waiting, you understand. I was not born for that. My father had been a clothier in Cheapside, my mother the daughter of a French glove-maker, respectable enough to read and write, humble enough to know my place. But I could dress hair, I could mix oils, I could stand for hours without complaint, and I knew when to speak and when to make myself into furniture. There were 6 of us who attended her person in those early mornings. Lady Mary, who had known her since childhood, oversaw everything. Then came the older women, Mistress Blanche, Mistress Catherine, who handled the jewels and the headdresses, and the younger ones, Anne, who arranged the ruffs and sleeves, Bess, who managed the stockings and shoes, and myself, who learned to prepare the face. It was Mistress Blanche who first showed me how to mix the ceruse. She did it in a small closet off the bedchamber, where the light was poor and the air close. I remember watching her hands, old hands, with spots like tea stains on the backs, as she measured white lead powder into a small silver dish. She added vinegar, drop by careful drop, stirring with a bone spatula. The mixture thickened into a paste, smooth and cold and luminous, like moonlight you could hold. "Not too thin," she told me. "It must cover, but not crack. And never let it touch your lips, girl. Never." "Why?" I asked. She looked at me then, properly looked, and I saw something flicker in her face. Not fear exactly, more like recognition, as if she was seeing me from a great distance, already knowing what I would become. "Because the remedy that makes her beautiful would make you something else," she said. "It is not meant for common skin. It burns what is not already pure." I did not understand her meaning then. I thought she meant that the paste was too fine for someone like me, that it was a privilege reserved for those of noble birth. It would be years before I understood that she was offering me a warning, and that by the time I heard it clearly, it was already too late. Let me describe a morning. Let me describe it so you can see it, smell it, feel the weight of it pressing on your shoulders, like the heavy gowns she wore, lined with whalebone and ambition. We rose before the sun. The palace never truly slept, of course. Somewhere always there were guards pacing, cooks banking fires, grooms tending horses. But in the hours before dawn, the private chambers existed in a kind of hush. We moved by candlelight, our breath visible in the cold. Even in summer those rooms were cold. Stone holds the chill like a miser holds silver. She would be awake already. I do not think she slept much even then. I would enter the bedchamber and find her sitting in her shift at the small table by the window, reading by the light of 3 candles. Latin usually, sometimes French. Her eyes would flick up as we entered, acknowledge us without warmth or dismissal, and then return to the page. We would begin with the washing. Mistress Blanche poured water from a porcelain ewer, Spanish, painted with blue flowers, into a silver basin. The water had been warmed over the kitchen fires and carried up, and it steamed faintly in the cold air. We would add rosewater from a crystal vial, and sometimes a few drops of oil of lavender. The scent would fill the room, covering the other smells, the older ones that clung to the hangings and the wood. She would stand, and we would remove her night shift. I learned not to look too closely at her body. It was not modesty that taught me this, but self-preservation. To see her as she truly was, unmarked by paint or cloth or light, was to glimpse something private and unguarded, and the court did not reward such seeing. But I saw enough. I saw that she was pale, always pale, even before the powders touched her. I saw the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the small imperfections that the paint would later hide. I saw that she was human, in other words, and mortal, though neither of these things were permitted to be spoken aloud. We washed her face with soft linen cloths, dipped in the warm water. We dabbed, never rubbed. The skin, Mistress Blanche told me, must not be irritated or reddened before the paste was applied. We worked in silence, mostly. Sometimes she would speak, a question about the weather, an instruction about the day's schedule, but more often she simply sat, her eyes half closed, her breathing slow and even. When the washing was done, we dried her face with clean linen, patting gently, and then Mistress Blanche would bring the ceruse. The first time I watched her apply it, I was struck by how careful she was. She used a small brush made of squirrel hair, dipping it into the paste and applying it in thin, even strokes across the forehead, down the nose, over the cheeks. She worked from the centre of the face outward, blending the edges where the white would meet the natural skin of the neck. It took perhaps half an hour to cover the entire face, and when it was done, the Queen looked like a statue carved from alabaster, smooth, flawless, cold. Then came the rouge, a paste made from crushed cochineal beetles mixed with egg white and gum arabic. Mistress Blanche applied it to the cheeks and lips with a different brush, building up the colour in layers until it glowed like embers beneath the white. And finally, the eyes. Belladonna drops, 2 in each eye, to widen the pupils and give them a bright, almost fevered look. I remember the first time I saw her blink after the drops were applied, how her eyes watered, and how she closed them for a moment, breathing slowly through her nose. "It passes," she said quietly. "It always passes." By the time we were finished, the sun would be rising. Light would creep through the narrow windows, turning the room from grey to gold, and the woman who had sat before us in her shift, pale and tired and ordinary, would be gone. In her place sat Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, painted and perfect and ready to face her court. I learned to do this work myself within 6 months. Mistress Blanche's hands had begun to shake, age perhaps, or something else, and Lady Mary decided that I should take over the preparation of the face. I was honoured, I think. Certainly I was afraid. But I did not refuse. One did not refuse such things at court. And so I became the keeper of the mask. The white lead powder came from Italy, though sometimes from Spain or the Low Countries. It arrived in small wooden boxes sealed with wax and was kept in the closet with the other cosmetics. The boxes were marked with symbols I did not understand. Crosses, circles, letters in Latin, and they were always locked away when not in use. Lady Mary held the keys. I learned to mix the paste by touch as much as by sight. Too much vinegar and it would be too thin, sliding off the skin before it dried. Too little and it would be grainy, leaving visible streaks. The consistency had to be perfect, smooth as cream, thick as honey, and it had to be made fresh each morning. Old ceruse turned grey and smelled of metal. Sometimes, when I was alone in the closet mixing the paste, I would hold the powder up to the candlelight and watch it shimmer. It was beautiful in its way, pure, luminous, like snow that had never touched the ground. I should have been more afraid of it. The months passed. I learned the rhythms of the court, the endless cycles of procession and ceremony, the careful choreography of favour and disgrace. I learned to recognise the important faces. Lord Burghley, with his grave eyes and his burden of state papers. The Earl of Leicester, still handsome despite his years, still watching the Queen with something that might have been love or might have been calculation. Sir Christopher Hatton, who danced better than any man I ever saw, and young Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who had not yet learned that charm was not the same as wisdom. I learned, too, the language of the court, the way a word could mean 6 different things depending on who spoke it and who listened, the way silence could be a weapon, the way a smile could hide a threat. And I learned about the other women. There were perhaps a dozen ladies of the bedchamber, daughters of good families sent to court to learn refinement and to find husbands. They lived in rooms adjacent to the Queen's apartments, and they attended her throughout the day, carrying her fan, holding her gloves, reading to her, playing music, laughing at her jests. They were all young, all beautiful, all accomplished, and they all wore ceruse. Not every day, perhaps, not as thickly as the Queen, but they wore it, at feasts, at balls, whenever there was occasion to be seen. They believed, as I had once believed, that beauty was a kind of currency at court, that a flawless face could purchase favour, that whiteness meant purity, and purity meant power. I watched them paint themselves. I watched them study their reflections in polished silver mirrors, turning their faces this way and that, searching for imperfections. I watched them compare themselves to each other, quietly, carefully, with the particular cruelty that comes from fear. There was Frances, Lady Howard, who had skin like milk even without the paint, but who applied it anyway because the Queen wore it, and one did not outshine the Queen. There was Lettice, who would later marry Leicester and earn the Queen's undying hatred, and who wore ceruse mixed with crushed pearls for extra lustre. There was Mary Shelton, who wrote poetry and played the virginals, and whose hands I noticed had begun to tremble slightly when she held her cup at dinner. And there was Catherine. Catherine Carey was the Queen's cousin, daughter of her Aunt Mary Boleyn. She was perhaps 22 when I first came to know her properly, in the winter of 1577. She had dark hair and dark eyes and a laugh that carried through the corridors like bells. The Queen was fond of her, I think, in the way she was fond of anything that reminded her of her mother's family without actually threatening her position. Catherine was kind to me. Not in any grand way, she did not give me gifts or single me out for special attention, but in small ways that mattered. She learned my name. She thanked me when I brought her warm water for washing. She once, when I stumbled carrying a heavy basket of linens, helped me pick them up without calling attention to my clumsiness. We spoke sometimes in the early mornings when I was preparing the cosmetics, and she was waiting her turn to be dressed. Nothing important. The weather. A piece of gossip about the French ambassador. The quality of the wine at the previous night's supper. But I came to look forward to those conversations, to the sound of her voice, to the way she treated me as if I were a person and not merely a pair of hands. She wore ceruse, of course. All the ladies did. But she wore it lightly, I thought. Just enough to smooth her complexion and brighten her face. Not so much that she looked like a painted doll. She was vain, perhaps, but no more than any young woman at court, and less than many. I should have warned her. But what would I have said? That the paste she wore might harm her, that beauty could be bought at too high a price. She would have laughed at me, kindly perhaps, but laughed nonetheless. And besides, I did not know, not then, not yet. The first sign came in the spring of 1578. Mistress Blanche fell ill. It began with headaches, she said, terrible headaches that made her sick to her stomach and sensitive to light. Then came the shaking in her hands, which had been mild before but now grew worse until she could barely hold a cup without spilling it. And then, finally, came the confusion. I remember finding her one morning in the closet, staring at the boxes of cosmetics as if she had never seen them before. When I spoke to her, she turned slowly, and her eyes had a strange, distant quality, as if she were looking at me from underwater. "I cannot remember," she said. "I cannot remember what I am meant to do." Lady Mary sent her away, gently, with a pension and a place in a house in Kent where she could be cared for. We were told she had grown old, that her mind had weakened with age, that such things happened and were part of God's plan. But I had seen her hands. I had seen the grey tinge to her skin beneath the face powder she sometimes wore. I had seen the way she would stand for long moments, swaying slightly, as if the room were moving around her. And I remembered what she had told me years before about the white paste, how it was not meant for common skin, how it burned what was not pure. I said nothing. What good would it have done? The court ran on appearance, on the maintenance of illusion. To question the means by which that illusion was created would have been to threaten the entire structure. And besides, I was young still, and unsure, and afraid of losing my place. So I took over her duties entirely. I became the one who mixed the ceruse each morning, who applied it to the Queen's face, who maintained the supply of white lead powder and rouge, and all the other substances that transformed a woman into an icon. And I tried not to think about Mistress Blanche alone in Kent, her hands shaking and her mind slowly unravelling like a piece of cloth pulled thread by thread. The court moved that summer. We went to Richmond, then to Greenwich, then north to Kenilworth, for a great entertainment hosted by Leicester. I remember that progress as a blur of heat and dust and baggage carts, of musicians and servants and endless protocol. The Queen travelled with nearly 200 people in her immediate household, and everywhere we went the local gentry came out to greet her, to offer her gifts, to bask in her presence. At Kenilworth, Leicester had arranged a spectacle. There were water pageants on the lake, fireworks, a masque performed on floating stages. The Queen sat beneath a silk canopy and watched it all, and she was magnificent. Her gown was cloth of gold, her neck hung with pearls, her face white and perfect as the moon. I stood behind her, out of sight, holding a small basket with her gloves and fan. And I watched the crowd watch her. I saw their faces, awe, hunger, devotion, envy. They saw what they needed to see: immortality, divinity, power. They did not see the woman I'd washed that morning, pale and tired, with small lines beginning to form at the corners of her eyes, despite all the Ceres in Christendom. Would you have seen it? Would you have known to look? That night, after the entertainment was done and the Queen had retired, I found Catherine sitting alone in the garden. It was late, past midnight, and the air was finely cool after the heat of the day. She was still in her court dress, though she had removed her headdress, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. I should have left her. But she looked up as I passed, and she smiled, and I found myself stopping. "You look weary," she said. "It was a long day, my lady. Sit." She gestured to the stone bench beside her. "Just for a moment. No one will see." I hesitated, but she was right. The garden was empty, and it would have been rude to refuse. I sat, careful to leave space between us, and for a while we said nothing. "Do you ever wonder," Catherine said finally, "why we do this?" "My lady?" "All of it. The paint, the pearls, the endless performance." She touched her face lightly, as if checking to see if it were still there. "Sometimes I wake in the morning, and I cannot remember who I am beneath it all." I did not know what to say to that. It was too honest, too dangerous. So I said nothing. "Forgive me." She laughed softly. "I have drunk too much wine, and I am melancholy. Take no notice. But I did take notice. I remembered her words later, when things had begun to change, when the mask had started to crack. We returned to London in September. The city smelled of smoke and river mud, and too many people pressed too close together. After the green spaces of the summer progress, Whitehall felt suffocating, all stone and shadow and the weight of old ambitions. The Queen's temper had grown short. She snapped at her ladies, at her ministers, at the servants who were too slow or too clumsy. Once, she threw a slipper at a girl who had dropped a jewellery box. The slipper missed, but the message was clear. We all walked more carefully after that. I think she was in pain. Not that she would ever admit it, of course, but I saw how she held herself, very straight and very still, as if movement cost her something. And her face, when I washed it in the mornings, had developed a strange texture, not quite smooth anymore, but slightly pitted, as if the skin were beginning to break down. I applied more ceruse to cover it. What else could I do? It was October when I noticed the change in Catherine. Small things at first. A cough that would not go away. A loss of appetite. She pushed food around her plate at dinner, but ate little. A certain dullness in her eyes, as if a light had been dimmed somewhere inside her. I asked if she was well. She smiled and said she was only tired, that the summer progress had worn her down more than usual. I wanted to believe her. But then came the morning when I entered the lady's chamber to find her standing before her mirror, staring at her reflection with an expression I could not read. Her face was already painted. She had done it herself, without waiting for help. But something was wrong with it. The ceruse was too thick on one side, too thin on the other, and there were streaks where her hand had shaken. "Catherine," I said softly. She turned to me, and I saw that she had been crying. The tears had left tracks in the white paint, dark lines running from her eyes to her jaw. "I cannot make it even," she said. "My hands shake." I went to her. I helped her wash the ceruse off, gently, carefully. And when her face was clean, I saw what the paint had been hiding. Her skin had a greyish cast to it. There were small sores at the corners of her mouth, and when I looked closely I could see a faint tremor in the muscles of her face, as if they were no longer entirely under her control. "How long?" I asked. "Since summer," she said. "Maybe longer. I thought it would pass." "Have you seen a physician?" What would I tell him? That I have made myself unwell with vanity? That I have traded my health for a smooth face? She laughed, but there was no humour in it. He would tell me to pray, to repent, to accept God's judgment, and he would be right. "Catherine, do not tell anyone," she said, gripping my hand. Her fingers were cold. "Please. If the Queen knows I am unwell, she will send me away. And if I leave court, I have nothing. I am nothing." I should have refused her. I should have gone to Lady Mary, to the Queen's physician, to someone in authority. But I looked at her face, at the fear in her eyes, at the trembling of her hands, and I made a choice. I kept her secret. Over the following weeks I helped her apply her cosmetics in the mornings, making sure the ceruse was even, that the rouge covered the greyish tone of her skin. I brought her food when she could not face the public meals. I stood beside her at court functions and steadied her when she swayed, and I watched her fade. The physicians might have called it many things: a wasting, a weakness of the constitution, an imbalance of the humours. But I knew what it was. I had seen it in Mistress Blanche. I would see it again in others. The pale remedy that had made her beautiful was turning on its mistress. By December, Catherine could no longer hide it. She had grown thin, her hands shook constantly, and she had developed a cough that racked her whole body. The Queen noticed finally and summoned her. I was not present for that audience, but I heard about it later. The Queen had been kind, they said, concerned. She had offered to send Catherine to one of her country estates to rest and recover. She had promised that her place at court would be waiting when she returned. Catherine accepted with grace. What else could she do? I helped her pack her belongings. She owned more than I would have thought: gowns, jewels, books, letters tied with ribbon. We worked in silence for the most part, folding and wrapping, filling trunks and baskets. When we were nearly done, she picked up her silver mirror, a small one, handheld, backed with an enamelled pattern of flowers. She looked at her reflection for a long moment, then handed it to me. "Keep this," she said. "I will not need it any more." "Catherine, please," her voice was very quiet. "Let me leave something behind." something that mattered. I took the mirror. It was heavier than I expected, and cold even through my gloves. She left the following morning. I watched from a window as her carriage rolled through the gates and disappeared into the grey London streets. I never saw her again. Word came in February. She had passed quietly in her sleep at her family's house in Hertfordshire. The cause was given as a fever, though no one specified what kind. There would be a funeral, a marker in the church, prayers said for her soul. I stood in the chapel at Whitehall when they rang the bells for her. The sound echoed through the stone corridors, hollow and final. Around me, the ladies of the court wept decorously into their handkerchiefs. The Queen sat very still, her face a white mask, her eyes dry. That night, alone in my small room, I looked at the mirror Catherine had given me. I tilted it this way and that, watching the candlelight slide across its surface. And then, very deliberately, I wrapped it in cloth and put it away at the bottom of my chest. I did not want to see my own face just then. The years that followed blur together in memory. 1579, 80, 81. The Queen grew older, but the mask grew thicker. More cerusse, applied more carefully to hide the texture of her skin, which had begun to roughen despite our best efforts. More rouge to give colour to a face that grew increasingly grey beneath the paint. More belladonna to brighten eyes that had seen too much. There were new girls at court, of course. There are always new girls, fresh-faced and eager, daughters sent from the counties to seek their fortunes, to catch a husband, to brush against power, and perhaps come away gilded. They learned quickly. They learned to curtsy, to flatter, to wear white faces and red lips, and to move through the court as if they were gliding rather than walking. Some of them learned too well. I began to see the pattern. A girl would arrive bright and pretty. She would be given a place among the ladies, taught the dances and the etiquette. She would see the other women, see how they painted themselves, see how the Queen rewarded beauty and grace, and she would begin to use the cerusse. At first, just for special occasions, then more often, then daily. And then, after a year or two or three, the signs would appear. The trembling hands, the grey skin, the confusion, the slow unravelling. Not all of them, mind you. Some wore the paste lightly enough that it did not touch them, or their constitutions were stronger, or they were simply lucky. But enough. Enough that I began to recognise the sequence, to predict who would fade and who would endure. And still, I said nothing. Still, I mixed the cerusse each morning. Still, I applied it to the Queen's face. Still, I kept the boxes of white lead powder locked in their cabinet. Still, I maintained the illusion. What would you have done? Would you have spoken? Would you have stood before the court and proclaimed that their beauty was slowly destroying them? They would have laughed at you. Or worse, they would have called you jealous, ignorant, mad. They would have pointed to the Queen herself, who had worn cerusse for decades and still lived, still ruled, still blazed like a sun across England. And they would have been right, in a way. The Queen survived. Whatever it was in the white lead that weakened others seemed not to touch her, or touched her more slowly. Perhaps her constitution was stronger. Perhaps she used less of it than we thought. Perhaps Providence protected her for England's sake, or perhaps she simply refused to let it break her. I never knew which. 1582, 1583. The court shifted and reformed like patterns in a kaleidoscope. Leicester grew older and more cautious. Burghley worked himself to exhaustion managing the realm. New favourites rose and fell. There was always intrigue, always conspiracy, always the shadow of the axe waiting for those who pushed too far. And there was Mary. Mary, Queen of Scots, held prisoner in England since 1568, had become the focus of every Catholic plot, every Spanish dream of invasion. She was still beautiful, they said, even in captivity. She still wrote letters in cipher, still maintained the dignity of a queen, still hoped for rescue or rebellion or miracle. The Queen hated her, not openly, not in any way that could be documented, but with the particular intensity of someone who sees in another person everything they themselves might have become. They were cousins, both granddaughters of Henry VII. Both had been declared illegitimate at various times. Both had suffered imprisonment, humiliation, the whims of men who believed they had the right to control a woman's fate. But Mary had married, had borne a son, had loved, or at least claimed to, and had paid for it with her throne and her freedom. The Queen had chosen differently, had made herself into something other than a woman, into a symbol, an ideal, a virgin untouched by human need. I do not know which of them was happier. In 1586, the conspiracies finally came to a head. There was a plot uncovered by Sir Francis Walsingham's spies in which Mary had supposedly agreed to the Queen's murder. Whether she truly consented or was entrapped by Walsingham's machinations, I do not know, but the evidence was there in Mary's own hand, or close enough to it that Parliament demanded action. The trial was held in October. I was not present, but I heard the accounts. Mary defended herself with dignity, they said, even though the outcome was never in doubt. She was found guilty of treason and sentenced to the long quiet that follows all such judgments. But the Queen would not sign the warrant. Weeks passed. Christmas came and went. The court waited. The Queen paced her chambers, snapped at her advisers, changed her mind 12 times a day. She knew what had to be done. She knew that Mary alive was a threat to England, to the Protestant faith, to her own life. But to sign the warrant was to acknowledge that even a queen could be reduced to a body beneath an axe, that sovereignty could be severed as easily as a neck. I saw her in those weeks, alone in her chamber before dawn, sitting before her mirror. She was not putting on her mask yet. She was simply looking at her face, the real face, unpainted, marked by time and worry and all the things she would not allow the world to see. "Do you think she prays?" the Queen asked suddenly, not turning to look at me. "My lady?" The Scottish Queen. "Do you think she prays for mercy or for vengeance?" I did not know how to answer, so I said, "I think she prays to be remembered." The Queen was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think you are right." She signed the warrant in February. The act itself was done quietly, almost casually, witnessed by a few secretaries, and then rushed away before she could change her mind again. Mary was told on the 7th of February. She died on the 8th at Fotheringhay Castle, in a room hung with black cloth. When news reached London, the Queen raged. She claimed she had not meant for the warrant to be delivered, that her ministers had acted without proper authority, that she was innocent of the Scottish Queen's ending. She threw Cecil's son, who had delivered the warrant, into the Tower. She wept in public, or at least made a show of weeping, her white face streaked carefully with what might have been tears or might have been rosewater. I do not know if her grief was real. I do not know if she understood in that moment that she had killed not just a rival but a version of herself, the Mary she might have been if she had chosen love over power, if she had borne a son, if she had been less careful, less controlled, less willing to transform herself into an icon at the cost of her humanity. But I know that her face that evening, when I removed the ceruse, looked older than I had ever seen it, as if something had been spent that could not be replenished. The Spanish came the following year. The Great Armada, 130 ships, sailed from Lisbon in May of 1588, with the blessing of the Pope and the ambition of Philip II. They would invade England, depose the heretic Queen, restore the Catholic faith. God was on their side, they believed. How could they fail? London held its breath. Beacons were lit along the coast. The militia was called up. Ships were fitted and provisioned, and the Queen, who had spent her entire reign avoiding war, preparing for war, balancing the books and the treaties and the impossible dance between Spain and France and Scotland, the Queen went to Tilbury. I was there, not at her side, but close enough to see, to hear, to remember. She arrived on the 9th of August, riding a grey gelding, dressed in white velvet with a silver cuirass over her bodice. Her hair was loose beneath a plumed helmet. She looked like an ancient goddess, or a saint, or something that had never been born but had always existed, eternal and untouchable. The army was arrayed on the fields, perhaps 20,000 men, common soldiers and gentlemen volunteers, armed with pikes and muskets and the stubborn English conviction that their island could not be taken. They roared when they saw her. Not a cheer, exactly. Something deeper and more frightening. Recognition, perhaps. Ownership. She rode among them, slowly, so they could see her, so she could see them. And then she spoke. I cannot remember all the words. Something about knowing she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. Something about how she would live or die amongst them, in the dust of the battle, rather than suffer dishonour. The words themselves mattered less than the fact that she was there, that she had come, that she had made herself visible and vulnerable and human for the first time in years. The men believed her. They would have died for her in that moment, and some of them did die later, though not at Tilbury. The Spanish never landed. Their armada was scattered by storms and English fireships and miscommunication. They limped home broken, and England rejoiced. But I remembered the Queen's face when she returned to London, when the mask was back in place and the performance was over. She looked exhausted, hollow, as if she had given them something that she could not afford to lose. They need me to be what they imagine, she said quietly that night, as I washed the paint from her face. Not what I am. I did not answer. What could I have said? The years turned. 1589, 90, 91. The Queen grew older still. Her teeth, which had never been good, began to fail. She had them pulled one by one, and the shape of her face changed, grew hollow at the cheeks. We padded the hollows with cloth when she appeared in public, tucked it carefully inside her mouth so her face would keep its shape. More cerise to cover the grey, more rouge to suggest life, more powder and paint and performance. The court grew younger around her. A new generation arrived, men and women who had been children when she took the throne, who had never known any other ruler. They looked at her and saw not a woman, but an institution, a monument, something as permanent as the Thames or the Tower. But I saw what they did not see. I saw the shaking in her hands that she hid beneath gloves. I saw the way she gripped the arms of her chair when she stood, as if the act of rising had become difficult. I saw the moments when her mind would wander, when she would stop mid-sentence and stare at nothing, as if listening to voices the rest of us could not hear. And still she painted her face. Still she dressed in jewels and cloth of gold. Still she danced, though her steps had grown slower, and she would sit between dances, breathing hard. Still she held court, heard petitions, argued with her counsellors, ruled her kingdom with the same sharp intelligence she had always possessed. She would not yield, not to age, not to infirmity, not to the suggestions that perhaps it was time to name an heir, to prepare for what must come. She had made herself into something immortal, and immortal things do not plan for their own ending. Essex came and went. Robert Devereux, Leicester's stepson, brilliant and reckless and convinced of his own destiny. The Queen loved him, I think, or loved what he represented: youth, beauty, the ghost of the men she had known in her own youth. She gave him command of armies, forgave his failures, tolerated his tantrums, until she could not. In 1599, he led a disastrous campaign in Ireland, then abandoned his post and rode back to London without permission. He burst into her bedchamber one morning, muddy from the road, desperate to explain himself before his enemies could poison her mind against him. I was there. I saw him enter, saw him drop to his knees, saw him reach for her hand. And I saw her face. She had not yet applied her cosmetics. Her hair was uncovered, thin and grey. Her face was bare, marked by age and wear and the long accumulation of years. She was 66 years old, and she looked it, and Essex was seeing her as she truly was for the first time. The expression that crossed his face lasted only a moment. Shock, perhaps, or disappointment, or the sudden shattering of an illusion. But she saw it. I saw her see it, and something in her went cold and hard and final. She sent him away. She forgave him, officially, but things were never the same between them. He plotted rebellion. He was arrested. He was tried. And in February of 1601, he was executed in the courtyard of the Tower, and the Queen signed the warrant without hesitation or regret. She never spoke of him again, at least not in my hearing. But sometimes, in the mornings, I would see her staring at her mirror, and I wondered if she was thinking of that moment when he had seen behind the mask, and what it had cost her to let him go. The new century felt like an ending, though we did not speak of it that way. Burley had gone to his rest in 98. Leicester had died years before. The men who had guided her through the dangerous early years were gone, replaced by younger advisors who had known only the legend, not the woman. The court still glittered. There were still masks and banquets and the endless machinery of ceremony. But there was a heaviness to it now, a sense of waiting. The Queen still appeared in public, still performed her role, but the performances grew shorter, the appearances less frequent, and the ceruse grew thicker. By 1602, I was using twice as much white lead as I had 20 years before. Her skin had grown rough, pitted, almost scaly in places. The paste would not adhere properly, would crack and flake within hours. I learned to mix it with egg white and ground alabaster to create a surface that would hold, but it looked less and less like skin and more like plaster. She did not complain. She never complained. She simply sat before her mirror each morning and let me paint her into existence. Transform her from the tired old woman who woke in the night with aching joints and failing sight into the immortal Virgin Queen who ruled by the grace of God and her own indomitable will. Did she know what the paste was doing to her? Did she understand that the same substance that had given her the face of a goddess for 40 years was slowly entering her flesh, settling in her bones, clouding her mind? I think she knew. I think she had always known. But I think she believed, as only the desperate can believe, that the alternative was worse, that to appear old was to appear weak, and to appear weak was to invite the wolves that had circled her entire reign, foreign powers, domestic rivals, men who would use her vulnerability as proof that a woman could not rule, that England needed a king, that God had finally withdrawn his favour from the heretic queen. So she painted her face, and I helped her, and we both pretended that the mask was real. In the winter of 1602 she fell ill. Not dramatically. There was no crisis, no moment when we feared for her immediate survival. But she grew weaker. She ate less. She spoke less. She spent long hours sitting in her chair, staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap. The physicians came and went. They prescribed their remedies, bloodletting, purges, herbal draughts, and she tolerated them with weary patience. But she was not getting better. By March of 1603 she could no longer stand without assistance. We moved her to Richmond Palace, where the rooms were smaller and easier to warm. She sat propped on cushions, wrapped in furs, her face still painted white, though there was no longer anyone to see it, but her attendants. I remember the last time I applied the ceruse. It was the 20th of March in the morning. The light was grey and cold, filtering through the windows like water through cloth. She sat very still as I worked, her breathing shallow, her eyes half closed. When I was done, I held up the mirror so she could see. She looked at her reflection for a long time, and I could not read her expression. Then she said, very quietly, "Put it away. I have no more need of it." I set the mirror down. I helped remove the ceruse. It came away in flakes, revealing the grey, exhausted skin beneath. I washed her face with warm water and dried it gently, and for the first time in 40 years, she faced the world with her true face. She looked smaller without the mask. Older, yes, but also simpler, more human, less alone. She died 3 days later, on the 24th of March at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was not with her at the end. Only the most senior ladies were permitted in the death chamber. But I heard the bells ring, and I knew. The court exploded into activity. Messages were sent to Scotland, where James VI waited to become James I of England. Proclamations were written. The machinery of succession, which the Queen had refused to acknowledge for 40 years, engaged with smooth efficiency. I stayed at Richmond for a week, helping to pack her belongings, to catalogue her jewels and gowns and papers, and in a small cabinet in her closet, I found the boxes of ceruse. Dozens of them, some full, some half empty, some so old that the seals had crumbled away. I stood there for a long time, looking at those boxes, thinking of Mistress Blanche with her shaking hands, thinking of Catherine, fading in Hertfordshire, thinking of all the women who had painted themselves white, believing that beauty would save them, that perfection could be purchased, that the price would not come due. And then I took the boxes, one by one, and I threw them into the fire. I watched them burn. The wood charred and split, the wax seals melted, and the white lead powder spilled out and turned grey in the flames, sending up thin wisps of smoke that smelled like metal and vinegar and all the years I had spent maintaining an illusion. No one stopped me. No one even noticed. They were too busy preparing for the new reign, for the new king, for the future that stretched ahead now that the long Elizabethan age had finally come to its end. I left court that spring. I was given a small pension, enough to live on if I lived modestly. I returned to London, to Cheapside, where I had been born. I found a small room in a house near the church, and I lived there quietly for the rest of my years. I never married. I never painted my face again. I kept Catherine's mirror wrapped in cloth at the bottom of my chest, and I never looked at it. But sometimes, on winter mornings when the light was grey and cold, I would wake from dreams of stone corridors and candlelight, and the particular smell of ceruse being mixed in a small silver dish. And I would remember what it had been like to serve beauty, to believe in appearance, to mistake the mask for the face beneath. I am old now. My hands shake, though whether from age or from the years I spent handling white lead, I cannot say. My memory wavers, returns, wavers again. But some things remain clear. I remember the weight of the powder in my hands. I remember the smell of the vinegar. I remember the sound of silk against stone, and the echo of music through corridors, and the way the Queen's eyes would look in the moment before I applied the belladonna drops, weary and sharp and endlessly, impossibly alone. I remember all the women who believed that beauty would save them, who painted themselves white like angels or ghosts or saints, who traded their health for smooth skin, their years for flawless faces, their futures for the fleeting approval of a court that would forget them the moment they were gone. And I remember thinking, even then, even when I was young and still believed in glory, I remember thinking that there must be a better way to be seen, a way that did not require us to cover ourselves in remedies that turned pale faces grey, that did not demand we transform ourselves into porcelain dolls, breakable and cold and perfect. But I kept that thought to myself, as I kept so many thoughts to myself over the years, because the court rewarded silence, and I wanted to survive, and survival meant knowing when to speak and when to simply hold the mirror steady, while someone else studied their reflection. Would you have done differently? Would you have refused to mix the paste, knowing what it might do? Would you have warned them, even though they would not have listened? Would you have chosen conscience over safety, truth over employment, your soul over your place in the world? I did not. I made my choices, and I have lived with them, and if there is judgment waiting for me when my own long quiet comes, then I will accept it. But I wanted you to know. I wanted someone to remember that it was not just one queen, one court, one moment in time. It was all of us who looked in mirrors and saw not what we were, but what we were meant to be. All of us who believed that appearance was armor, that beauty was currency, that we could paint ourselves into permanence. And all of us were wrong. The mask always cracks in the end. The paint flakes away. The mirror shows the truth, whether we wish to see it or not. I've kept this testimony locked away for many years. I'm leaving it now for whoever finds it, whenever that may be. Not as confession or excuse, but simply as witness. This truly happened. In the reign of Elizabeth, the first of that name, Queen of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, in the years between 1558 and 1603, in the chambers of Whitehall and Richmond and Greenwich, there were women who painted their faces white with a paste made of lead and vinegar. They believed it would make them beautiful. They believed it would keep them young. They believed it would protect them from the cruelties of age and time and the judgment of a world that valued appearance above all else. Some of them it killed slowly. Some of them it merely marked, leaving them with shaking hands and grey skin and minds that wandered like lost children. And some of them it spared, for reasons I never understood, leaving them to live long lives and die in their beds, their faces still smooth, their secrets still hidden. But all of them, every single one, paid a price for their beauty. We all did. Those of us who wore the paste, and those of us who mixed it, and those of us who stood by and said nothing while the mask was applied, layer after careful layer, until the face beneath was forgotten entirely. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not expect understanding. I ask only that you remember, beauty is not armor. Perfection is not permanent. And the remedies we use to hide our mortal selves often prove more dangerous than the flaws we sought to cover. These are the things I learned in the service of Gloriana. These are the things I carry with me still, even now, even at the end. The mirror does not lie. It simply shows us what we have made of ourselves and asks us if the making was worth the price. I leave you with that question. I have no answer to give, only this testimony, only this truth. In the court of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, beauty itself became a kind of ending, and I was there. I saw it. I remember. And now I have told you, so that you might remember too, the rest is silence.